Everybody, welcome back to the How Did It Happen podcast powered by Windjack Studios. So happy to have you here as I am with every episode, and I've got an amazing success story to share with you today. John List has joined me on the podcast. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Mike.
So I heard John on another podcast. I think it was some little podcast called Tim Ferriss, I think, and talking about his new book. It's so much about not just the book, but his life that resonated with me that I reached out and asked him if he would come on, and thankfully he's here today. And you're going to love this. So let me tell you a little bit about John. John A. List is the Kenneth C. Griffin Distinguished Service Professor in Economics at the University of Chicago. He's also the chief economist at Lyft. His new book is The Voltage Effect: How to Make Good Ideas Great and Great Ideas Scale. His research has led to collaborative work with several different firms, including Lyft, Uber, United Airlines, Virgin Airlines, Humana, and a bunch of others. For decades, his field experimental research has focused on issues related to the inner workings of markets, the effects of various incentive schemes on market equilibria and allocations, how behavioral economics can augment the standard economic model, early childhood education and interventions, and most recently on the gender earnings gap in the gig economy using evidence from rideshare drivers. So basically, he studied all sorts of behavior from an economic standpoint, and maybe a little bit more than an economic standpoint. I'm going to ask him about that. His research includes more than 200 peer-reviewed journal articles and several published books, including the bestseller he co-authored with Uri Gneezy, The Y-Axis: Hidden Motives and the Undiscovered Economics of Everyday Life. John was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2011 and a fellow of the Econometric, I guess is how you say that, Society in 2015. He received the 2010 Kenneth Galbraith Award, the 2008 Yrjö Prize for Senior Economists for his research in behavioral economics in the field, and was the 2012 Yrjö Jahnsson Lecture Prize recipient. He is also the current editor of the Journal of Political Economy. You can follow John on Twitter at Econ4Everyone. John, thank you so much for being here. I start every show with the same question, and that is, how did it happen for you?
So, Mike, thanks so much. From that introduction, I understand that you have just learned economies and all of our words that we make up, like heteroskedasticity and all of these fun words like econometrics are fun to learn. But thanks so much. You're doing a good job.
Thanks. I'm glad that other one wasn't in there, the header or whatever.
Yeah, heteroskedasticity.
Yeah,
I was like,
thank you for excluding that.
Okay, but you're doing a good job. Look, half the battle with learning economics is learning the language, is learning, which I call economies. So, okay, how did it happen for me? I would say it's one part luck and one part economic thinking. Okay, so let me unpack that. The family that I come from is a very proud family, wonderful family, but a family that might not place as much emphasis on education is what I place on my children. I'm a first-gen college kid, and I was really a first-gen college kid a little bit by mistake. My dream was to be a professional golfer, and I went on a partial golf scholarship to University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point. I grew up in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, so a little village outside of Madison. When I was a kid, we had about 9,000 people in the city. It's grown a lot since because Madison has grown so much, but went to Stevens Point, and I learned very quickly in that first year of golf that I didn't have a chance. So what I mean by that is I wasn't ever going to make a difference in golf. I just wasn't good enough. And it's a little bit lucky on the one hand to receive a golf scholarship that allowed me to go to college. That's the luck part. And the other side of luck is that my research agenda became important, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the economic thinking side was that I figured out the opportunity cost of my time. And that's something that most people neglect. But what I mean by opportunity cost of time is that I figured out if I keep spending 8 hours a day in golf, that's really what our day was, 8 hours a day, it would have been really hard to be a really good economics student. I was always interested in studying economics, but if you want to be a professor in economics, you really have to be all in. You can't be half in and then all in golf. So I realized that the opportunity cost of my time in golf was just too great. So my golf dream there ended. I continued with my scholarship and I played the 4 years, but I really spent a lot more time focusing on learning economics and studying economics at that point.
But, okay, before I ask you a question about the golf, which I felt like it was really interesting, a story that you told about the golf. I want to piggyback on that. I first want to ask this question about your book, John, because right off the bat, this word scale gets used all the time, and you have it in the subtitle of your book. Yeah. And the last sentence of your book, I believe this is the last sentence of your book: the only way to meaningfully change the world is at scale. And here's the thing that I want to ask you about is, I don't think many people know what that even means. It's a word that gets used a lot and people associate it with growth. And it's kind of like everyone says, well, if you can't scale, it's not worth doing, that kind of thing. But I don't know. I want to know how you actually define it, because it's going to be sort of the foundation of a lot of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for that. I want to first dispel the myth that if your idea can't take over the world, you shouldn't do it. I think that's an issue that I bring up in the epilogue of the book. And I bring it up through the lens of my family. My family is essentially one man, one truck, one good life. And there's no need to scale more. And I'll talk about what I mean by scaling in a moment. To scale more, they're happy with that. And that's a great life for them. Now, when I think of scale, I want you to think about my experiences at Chicago Heights. So Chicago Heights is a community around Chicago that I started a preschool back in 2010. So that preschool is meant to help 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. I built it from soup to nuts. Now, when I think of scaling, I think of, first of all, I built that preschool to help those kids in Chicago Heights. I built it to write academic papers about what have we learned on the education production function from that experiment. But I also built it because I wanted to take what worked in Chicago Heights, and I wanted to first horizontally scale it, which meant I want a school in Minneapolis, a school in Denver, a school in LA. So does my result scale from Chicago Heights horizontally? And then I also wanted to scale it vertically. And what I mean by that is, instead of just one school around Chicago, I want 1,000. So to do that now is a totally different proposition than to do the horizontal scaling. And what I mean by that is, if I have to hire 30 teachers in Chicago Heights, like I did in my pilot experiment, so if I want to do that in New York, I have to hire 30 teachers there. If I want to do it in Atlanta, 30 teachers there. Now instead, that's okay, I can do that. But if I want to hire 30,000 teachers around Chicago and vertically scale it, that's an entirely different proposition. So when I think of scaling, I think of scaling across markets and within markets, and we should figure out before we invest in our idea, whether it can scale, how it can scale, and where it can scale, because we waste way too much money in throwing dollars at ideas because we try to move fast and break things, throw spaghetti against the wall and whatever sticks, you cook it. We have too much of that. And our federal government, our state governments can't afford to do that anymore because the solutions to our major problems are not coming by way of move fast and break things. It's not working.
Yeah. Okay. And well, thanks for clarifying that, because I think that's something that everybody can kind of get their arms around. Like, I can't dominate a whole market, say Chicago, for example, because there's not enough available in a something that requires talent, people. There's not enough talented people around in order for me to do that. But on the horizontal side, if I go to these different geographies, different markets, I can surely find 30 or 50 people who have what our top talent, let's say.
I love that, Mike. You're exactly right. So in the original experiment, what we find, or in the original pilot, what we find is good teachers are non-negotiables. So we find that in the experiment. That's what we need to always do in the Petri dish, is figure out what are your non-negotiables. And then you can scale where you can find those non-negotiables. And you're exactly right. If I try to scale too big in Chicago, good luck. I can't find 30,000 good teachers. But I can scale horizontally. Now that's important to know before I spend money.
Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to get back to the golf for a second, because I didn't know, and it's been a little while since I did listen to the book, but I didn't know it was that early, like your freshman year where you made that, because I remember you talking about playing golf with, it was Jerry Kelly and Steve Stricker or something. They were, maybe you weren't playing with them, but you were playing in a tournament with them. And I remember you were talking about quitting is not bad or something like that. There's a chapter like quitting is not bad. Yeah. And you came out of that experience with the realization, as I recall, that these guys were a few years ahead of you, but in age, but in, they were 5 strokes or 6 strokes or 7 strokes ahead of you. And you're thinking, that's just an insurmountable, I can't make up that many strokes or something like that. Is that
no,
you sort of push you over?
No, 100%. So, I played against those guys in high school. So I was a sophomore when Jerry was a senior, and we're in the same conference. So we played together. And the difference wasn't that great in high school. Okay. So, he went to Hartford. Steve Stricker went to University of Illinois. And they came back, and it was the fall of my freshman year. And they came back for some golf at Cherokee Country Club, which is a country club in Madison, Wisconsin. And I just happened to have that weekend off of our golf. So I went out there to practice on Friday. And on the range, I noticed that their games had markedly improved from the last time I had seen them. And mine really hadn't improved that much. So I kind of looked at the improvement function. Mm-hmm. And then I looked at what happened that day. We all played the same course. Didn't go very well for me there. And then I went back and looked and scoured data from our local library because I wanted to make sure that what I was seeing wasn't a bogey. And lo and behold, after you look at all the data, it wasn't working for me. So at this point, however, I was raised in Wisconsin really under the umbrella of Vince Lombardi. And I was born in the late 60s. Vince Lombardi was winning NFL championships and then Super Bowls in the late 60s. Right. And Vince Lombardi taught me that winners never quit and quitters never win. And let's face it, society as a whole tells us that quitting is repugnant. Mm-hmm. And if you type in quitting and inspirational quotes, you'll find enough posters on the internet that you'd have to cut down half of the Amazon to print out all those posters that tell you not to quit. So I was dealing with both society telling me that you're a loser if you quit, and also kind of the way I was brought up. you don't quit. So I of course, I didn't quit the team, but mentally, my dream was done. And I needed to explore and discover a new dream. And that's exactly what I talk about in chapter 9, I think or 8. It's called Winners Quit. Because winners do quit, but they call it pivoting, and they call it calling audible. If we would just stop calling it quitting and say, I'm calling an audible, we'd all be all right, won't we?
Yeah, I see a new inspirational poster. It's like
Exactly.
audibles are cool, right? Or something.
It's not quitting, it's calling an audible. Look what happened to Peyton Manning. Right? You're a football fan, Mike?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yes,
Peyton Manning's in the Hall of Fame because he knew how to call audibles. He could throw a little bit, but he was pretty good at calling audibles.
Yeah. And Denver got pretty smart about picking him up too after his career was over, right? Yeah.
Picked up another Super Bowl. They had a pretty good team around him, of course. He wasn't really that good that year that they won the Super Bowl, but what the heck?
Well, yeah. It doesn't matter now whether he was or not.
Exactly. I mean, he was really good in Indy, of course, but he was good enough to win the Super Bowl.
So this quitting thing and what you were talking about earlier was like throwing spaghetti on a wall sort of approach, or move fast, break things. It reminds me of you have this thing you talk about in the book, and hopefully this makes sense. You tell me if it doesn't, but this policy-based evidence versus evidence-based policy. And when I'm looking at those two things you were talking about, I thought, well, I should ask, because those sort of seem like, and they may not. You had different examples, I think, in the book, but it's like, who's wagging, what's wagging? Is the tail wagging the dog, or is the dog wagging the tail, when it comes to making decisions? So what is it with us that we believe so much in our ideas that we don't think we need to test them? So much of your work is testing ideas that people think they know the answer to, and all of a sudden you say, well, let's prove it, right? Yeah. You have tons of examples in the book about this, but what is it about us, John? What?
Yeah. No, Mike, you've hit on some very important questions in that soliloquy, absolutely. So let's start with, what is it about us? I think we are a bundle of psychological biases that are just waiting to be let loose. And the particular bias that you're bringing up that I think is important in this area is called confirmation bias. So we have an idea about something that might work. So, for example, we think the early childhood program that I did in Chicago Heights, you might have a belief that, that's going to work, or it's not going to work, whatever. If you believe it's going to work, when you gather new information, you tend to accentuate the new information that is consistent with your belief. And you tend to argue that, well, these data that aren't consistent with my belief, they're really not true. They're really not legitimate data. And you try to find a flaw in them. And I think in many cases, especially men who tend to be overconfident, we have a belief that's so strong about something that there tends to be some evidence in favor and some against in nearly every decision making that's important for you. And you tend to accentuate what conforms to your beliefs. So I think that's number one. We have confirmation bias. Now, number two, in thinking about policy-based evidence versus evidence-based policy, here's what I mean by that. Let's start by saying, anytime we use data to make decisions, that's a good thing, right? So it's the evidence-based policy revolution of the last 20 or 30 years. That's a good thing. What's happened in the social sciences, though, is you have an idea, you go and test it, and typically you give your idea its best shot of working. Okay, it's called an efficacy test.
Okay.
So it's like, give your theory its best shot, or give your data or your idea its best shot. Okay, so you run the experiment, giving your idea its best shot. It works. you write it up in an academic paper, you publish it, you forget to tell everyone it was an efficacy test, and then you move on and work on something new while everyone else digests your work and implements it. Now, that is what has gotten us into all this trouble, because what you need to do is say, look, what are the constraints at scale? What are the constraints in the real world? And bring those constraints to your original research or to the Petri dish and say, does my idea work with the warts or the constraints that any idea will face when you scale it? When you do that, that's what I call policy-based evidence, because you're looking at the environment that you're trying to scale into and asking, does my idea work in that environment? And if it does, great, that's a scalable idea. If it doesn't, now we need to say, what do we need to change to see if our idea can work in the real world? So really, it's obvious what I'm proposing. It's obvious in the back of your head, you're probably thinking, of course, John's right. Yeah. We should make sure that we test our ideas with the same flaws and the same constraints that they're going to face at scale. Because if we don't, what are we doing when we scale? We're guessing. We're moving fast and breaking things when we know they're not going to work. And I think that's why we don't have solutions to poverty, to public education, to discrimination, because we're not serious about looking into the environments where we want to scale, bringing those to the Petri dish and saying, does my idea work in that environment?
And what has to be, I want to get back to the discriminate thing, because you have a paper on that I wanted to ask you about, John. But what is it about us thing that you just answered? In your experience, the companies that you come into actually work with, some of them I mentioned at the beginning, but what has to be going on typically inside of a company for them to be receptive to you? Because you were just saying, they're probably mostly men. They probably have very strong confirmation bias about what works in their business. And they probably don't think they need help. They probably don't, maybe intuitively they do, but we're going to be rugged individualists. We're going to hammer through this. And
absolutely. No, it's a good question. So early on, it was companies that were in trouble. And what I mean by that is companies like Chrysler, Sears, firms that had found themselves on the difficult end of either their product space or their competition space. They were having difficulties. And then let's throw out a bunch of lines, and one of them can be the economist, John List, and we'll see if he can help us. It has slowly become entrepreneurs like Travis Kalanick or Logan Green at Lyft or Humana or Amazon or Walmart, what have you. These firms are doing great. And in the end, they really don't need me. But what they're realizing is that a dash of economics and a small dosage of let's figure out some causal relationships. And if we can generate data in an optimal way and combine it with economics, we can make better decisions. So the firms that are opening up more and more, I believe, are the ones who are looking for better solutions today, looking to have an edge tomorrow. And I think that's what economics and data generation can give them. So the things I work on in a firm, whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit or government group, is I work on any issue related to economics in their firm. And since I'm a believer that economics is life and life is economics, economics has a seat at every table within an organization.
And you, in the book, you talk about your different experiences at Uber and Lyft in particular. And as I was listening to it and now listening to you now, I was thinking, oh, well, what John really is sort of a mix between an economist and sometimes an industrial psychologist or some type of psychologist too, because it's not just about numbers. Like people think about economics and they think, well, it's just about numbers. The way they think that a CFO only handles the money, where a real CFO is really, and very engaged in the whole thing. Is it like that, John, when you go into some of these places?
No, that's a great analogy. I'm glad you brought that up. Early on in my career, I spent most of my time at baseball card shows and conventions where collectors were, because that's how I could afford to do field experiments. I funded it with my baseball card collection that I purchased in the late 70s as a kid. Nobody else wanted to fund my field experiments, so that's how I did them. So early on, I thought of myself as an economic anthropologist. I would understand the nuts and bolts of a market, and then I would bring in the disciplined thinking that the economics model can provide with what I knew about the market. Now, over time, my interests evolved into not only being an economic anthropologist, but I became interested in psychology and the underpinnings of how we can use psychology to learn about economics and behavior in the field. That's become behavioral economics now. Okay. I've also taken on interest in sociology, and that's because the sociological aspects, the network effects that we have in our economy are super important. I wrote a paper called The Social Side of Human Capital Formation and how important neighborhoods are to teaching our young children. So I'm part sociologist. I'm also part computer scientist. How am I part computer scientist? Well, we do a lot of coding and we have mounds and mounds of data. So my team is roughly 10 people at Lyft. We have to do a lot of programming. And we have to do a lot of programming to make sure we're learning about what's happening in our mounds and mounds of data. So sort of a jack of all trades a bit, in that I try to bring in the understandings from different disciplines. Sometimes you need psychology, sometimes you need sociology, sometimes you need anthropology, but it's always with a dash of economics, because I think economics ends up lending this very disciplined approach to understanding incentives and the underpinnings of why somebody's doing something through the lens of what are the incentives that are moving these people. And once you understand that, the rest is sort of dressing around the problem and how you can get to, let's say, first best or the maximum.
Okay. I'm glad you addressed that, because I was walking my dog and I was listening to Adam Grant, and I'm listening to him talk, and I'm like, he sounds a lot like List, from the book. And I'm like, wait a second, there's a blending going on here. And then I remembered you do have a chapter in the book, I believe, on culture. And
that's right. And
I was like, when that chapter came up, I was like, I wasn't expecting that at all. But it just made me think about how, like people put economists in a box, and probably because a lot of them will stay in a box. They want to give just economic forecasts and stuff. And you are, like you said, a psychologist, behavioral sociologist, all of these things. It's just, it's kind of, I don't know how you put all those disciplines together and make it work. But you do. It's really cool.
Thank you.
Well, and speaking of culture, like you go to some pretty decent lengths in the book talking about the differences in your experience at Uber, from the interview process all the way through, the time you spent there versus Lyft, two companies that at least I know they have different divisions that do different stuff, but on the rideshare thing, two that you could say are commoditized as being the same. But yet you have an app, you get in the car, you call the car takes you where you want to go. Usually not back to your house, which is one of the stories you tell in the book. But
I'm still angry about that, by the way.
Yeah. So John had to go somewhere. An Uber picked him up. I believe it was an Uber that time.
It was Uber.
And he thought he was, going downtown Chicago or something. And he's working on his presentation, and all of a sudden he looks up and he's back at his house. That's not the experience that you want to leave the client with. But anyway, can you talk a little bit more about the differences in those and how both are scaling, I think, right? Both are, just making tremendous, they're creating a new, economy themselves, sort of.
Oh yeah.
But so different the way you described it.
Yeah. No, you're right. I was talking to my kids the other day about Uber and Lyft, and I don't think that our kids can even understand how different travel is around cities. Just in the last 10 years, how disruptive and innovative, both Travis and was on the Uber side, and John and Logan were on the Lyft side. I used to fly into Boston, Logan, and stand in line for 45 minutes waiting for a cab. And now it's touch, and half the price you're traveling to your destination. So the one thing that the industry has, however, is a differentiation problem. And what I mean by that is when a car pulls up, you don't know if it's an Uber or a Lyft. Many of them have both stickers on.
Yeah.
They have both stickers, so the person's dual lapping. But it's a real issue if you don't even know what kind of product or service you're purchasing. I always say, at least Coke and Pepsi have different cans.
Right.
In Uber and Lyft, we don't even have different cans. So one part of that then is you have to try to differentiate on some different levels. You can create a new product or new service, but within 6 months, the other one copies you because it's really hard to trademark share or black or whatever, or LX or whatever you want to call it. So it looks like from the outside, these monsters or organizations are isomorphic. But when you're on the inside, it's very different. And it's very different in the sense of we are doing this as a team, and we are doing this as an organization that is trying to change the world. Both of them have that view. Both of them have the view that data is our DNA, and we are going to use data until the end to drive decision making. But at least when I was back at Uber, where the similarities ended is more or less from the process of getting from a question to a final answer. It was a little bit like what happens in some academic circles, where the debate can be very heavy and the scrutiny can be very, very heavy as well. And it can be a very intense process. And it was always meant to get to the right answer and get to the right answer as quickly and efficiently as possible. So there was never any issue about some demon trying to hurt others. It wasn't that way. It was just the process of getting to the solution is just a little bit different between the two companies. Where at Lyft, you can think of, they started driving cars with pink mustaches on the front.
Right.
And this is a pink mustache family. And these are family members who you're dealing with. And that's how you work together. The pink mustaches would still be on the cars if they hadn't fallen off and caused some accidents, right? They'd still be on. But that isn't just for show. That's exactly how Logan and John run the business and exactly how they want things. Now, I have no idea how Uber is run today. when the execs left, I'm sure they had dramatic change as they rolled over everyone at the exec level. I know Dara wanted to make that a key feature of his leadership, is he wanted to add much more responsibility in terms of the leadership showing respect and care for all of the workers. I think that when the engineer's email went viral and blog post went viral about what she had experienced, I think Dara's mission was to reverse course on that. And from everything I've heard, he's been able to do a good job on that. So my guess is that Uber and Lyft are pretty similar.
Okay. Well, I haven't experienced the kind of growth that either one of those companies has experienced, but it always seemed to me that civility matters to people, because the human likes predictability. They can take bad news, they can change, but they can't take, like, one day it's going to be like this and the next day it's going to be like this. It's just very nerve-wracking. That's my experience, at least. Yeah. Are you going to watch the Showtime show on Uber that's coming out?
Absolutely. I've urged, I'm sure I'm not going to be in there at all, but I urged them, if I am, I want Matt Damon to play the chief economist. So I don't know, Mike, if you can put in a word for me, I'd appreciate that.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah. Hang on. I'll text him right after the show.
Yeah, text him, please. It's the least they can do for me. Now, I'm sure I won't be a part of it, but I'll probably recognize some of the features on the show, I'd suspect.
Yeah, well, maybe they'll, who knows, maybe they'll get into the tipping thing when you, because that's a kind of an interesting thing.
Absolutely.
And I do want to talk about that. But before I go there, I wanted to add one more thing to your description of yourself as, like we were saying, an economic anthropologist, psychologist, behavioral sociologist, all computer programming. I want to add chameleon to that, John, because you are one of the few people that I know who, have sort of blended the academic world, the corporate world, and the government world. I didn't mention that in the bio, but you worked in the Bush administration as well. And so the first thing I want to ask you is, how do you blend? Like, just you personally, how do you fit in all of these different places? And then where do you feel most or least comfortable?
Yeah, good question. So on the first one, I think the secret sauce is one part, if you can explain the principles of economics and apply the principles of economics to problems, those types of solutions are really ubiquitous in the sense that that kind of thinking traverses every situation. So what I worked on in the federal government was the Kyoto Protocol. I worked on the Clear Skies Act. I worked on the softwood lumber trade dispute. So these are issues that I was advising the president on in environmental and resource economics. And day by day, as I sat through meetings, many of my arguments would be Econ 101. And what I mean by that is applying principles to problems. I was part of the task force that put together the Homeland Security.
Okay.
In that agency, working with Colin Powell, Condi Rice, Mueller, and others. And I was just adding simple economics to those discussions. And when I look at my work within organizations, it always starts with being able to explain how economic principles can help us think through a problem. Now, in the academy, of course, it begins with first principles, but to publish papers, you have to be doing many more advanced things. And those are, so to answer your second question, the academy is my true home, and I'm a scientist through and through. So I feel the most at home in using economics in an advanced way to try to stay on the frontier and push the frontier. So I would say that's my true home. And I like to apply what I learn in the ivory tower to these other settings, because a little bit of economics can go a long way to affecting positive change in every setting.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned early on that you learned the opportunity cost of your time early, probably earlier than most of us do. And I'm wondering how you've applied that. I know how you've applied that to other folks because you have talked about it, you describe it a lot in your book, but how do you apply that to you?
Yeah. You know, when I first learned economics, I thought that it was all obvious. And I didn't understand why people would have trouble understanding. And then when I started to teach economics, I learned why people have trouble. Because you start out, you're teaching a new language. As we talked about before, you're teaching economies to people. Yeah. You have some math. You have abstract and very critical thinking. And you have a lot of logical conclusions that you have to reach when you think like an economist. So if you don't naturally think like an economist, it's really hard to learn economics. I've just always thought like an economist. And when I learn economics, it's just common sense to me. But it's certainly not common sense to most people, because in many ways, it's a foreign way to think for the majority of people. Okay, so how do I apply that type of thinking? When you think about why people quit jobs, you ask them, and I've done this in surveys where I say, why did you quit your job? Typically, the first frontline response is, my boss no longer appreciated me. Second type of response is, I didn't receive the promotion or pay raise that I thought I deserved. Third line of response is, I got cross with a coworker. Okay. In each of those situations, the person's current lot in life got soiled and they were pushed to move. I have never quit a job because my current lot in life was soiled. Every time I've quit, and I've had a lot of jobs. I started at University of Central Florida. I went to the University of Arizona. I went to the University of Maryland, came to the University of Chicago. I worked at Uber, now Lyft. The way I think about it is, what does my opportunity set look like? And has my opportunity set gotten better in that it draws me to join? So most of the time, people neglect their opportunity cost of time. And when you neglect your opportunity cost of time, you don't realize that, look, I'm the chief economist at Lyft. What opportunities am I foregoing as a chief economist at Lyft? Well, for one, I can't be the chief economist at Walmart. So if that opportunity set gets really good, I'm eventually going to have to tell Lyft, I'm going to leave because my opportunity set has gotten better and there's new science and there's new explorations at a different firm. And I can tell you that will probably happen sooner rather than later, Mike. I don't want to give a drop the mic thing, but
breaking news. Hold on, everybody.
Breaking news, exactly. So today's my last day at Lyft, and I will be joining another top firm within the next 30 days. That's there you go. That's a fact. So it's natural for me to think about my opportunity set and not to neglect the opportunity cost. And I don't think that's natural for people. So that's an example of just applying standard economic logic that is first principles for me, but it tends to be work for others. Mike, how do you think about it? Do you think about your opportunity cost of time?
I do. I think about it a lot, but I still end up getting into things that I know are not going to are not maximizing my opportunity cost time. John, less now than before. Like when I first was an entrepreneur, I would give up opportunity costs all day long because I always thought everything I was chasing would turn into gold. Who knows? Gold. It's one of those things. Who knows whether it's going to be good? So I have to do it. Is there like a simple matrix that people could use, John, to think through, like a simple thinking matrix?
I do think in terms of quitting, I do think we should periodically take a look at whether our opportunity set has gotten a lot better. And what I'm talking about here is maybe every few months, whether it's an apartment or a job or what have you, take a look and see, is there a way or another job that will use my comparative advantage, that will better leverage what I'm good at? Right. Because a lot of times you take a job because you want to make a living, but you realize through that process that maybe this isn't the perfect fit, and maybe they're not leveraging my skills as well as they could. So that's not a good thing. So you should periodically look around. I would say don't move or quit until you know you have a great opportunity. So I don't want people quitting just to quit. But if you have a great opportunity, it's a sure thing, and it's going to take better advantage of what you're good at, go for it. We don't do that enough.
And thank you for that. And you talked about the quitting thing before with the golf, but then you mentioned Central Florida. Is that the first place you went? And if I recall, you applied to like 150 places. Yeah. And 149, Central Florida said yes. It was the first one to say yes out of 150. So there's that part of not quitting, because you were at that point, I suppose you were just bought in that you were on the right path. And so you didn't go to the library and look for 2 days and look at stats like you did in the golf thing, right? You knew. Is that right? Or
no, you're 100% right. And this happened sort of twice early in my career. One was I applied to 150 schools. I only got one interview. And usually you'd get maybe 20 to 30 interviews. So that was a really bad sign. And the other one was nobody believed in my field experiments, really. And they didn't think that using the world as your lab was the right way to go about economic research. Now, in the first case, it really was the case that I'm really not good at anything but economics. So if I would have quit economics, like if UCF wouldn't have worked, I'm not sure what I would have done. But there really wasn't an outside opportunity for me. I mean, what else am I going to do if I can't make it? So the fact that I didn't have anything else to go to, had UCF not worked, I'm not sure what I would have done. In the field experiments it was kind of clear to me that as soon as I would explain what field experiments were about and how useful and important they can be to economics, then people did come around. So that was a process of educating and teaching. But you're right. It wasn't the case that I was looking around right away because I was convinced it was my comparative advantage, economics.
Got it. Well, I'm glad you left us with that. I'm glad I got to that because I feel like you have to say yes to a lot of things before you learn what you need to say no to.
That's right.
This opportunity cost is something you have to develop. And I feel like if you right off the bat or be like, nope, I'm not going to do this, or, I'm only going to do this things, or I'm only going to do what I'm passionate about, or some of the stuff you hear on the inspirational posters we were talking about earlier, you really haven't given yourself the opportunity to understand what your opportunity cost is.
I think that's a great point. I'm so glad you made that, Mike. I think early on, youngsters don't experiment enough and they don't try enough new jobs or new situations or tasks, in that they never gain a chance to figure out what they're good at and how they can change the world. And I think more and more as people begin to understand and appreciate their opportunity cost of time and opportunity cost of doing a task at work means you can't do another task. It means you can't learn what you're good at. And I think that is going to lead us to more and more experimentation in the workplace and more trial by error. I think that's a good point, Mike.
And last question for you. Is it more intimidating to write a book and see what people think about it? Or is it more intimidating to write an academic paper and see what people think about it?
That's great question. I think academic paper for two reasons. One, let's face it, that's my real currency. Mm-hmm. My real currency as a scientist is what my colleagues and contemporaries think about my work and how future economists use my work. So that is my true currency. The second is because a lot of our, let's say, reviews come in an anonymous way. So the way that the Academy works is you send your paper into a journal and you tend to get maybe 2, 3, or 4 anonymous reports. And those reports can be quite snarky. And they still hurt my feelings in many cases. Most of the book reviews, now there are some on Amazon that are snarky and they're anonymous and they hurt my feelings. But in the Academy, it tends to be really concentrated in that they're the best other minds in the Academy who are telling you that you're dumb. And that really hurts. I mean, it really hurts anytime. But when you have another academic saying that something you've worked on for a big part of your life, you're completely wrong on, that stings and it really does hurt.
How do you handle it when you have the opportunity to be that reviewer?
Yeah. I'm an editor now, as you mentioned at the beginning, and I've just also started a new journal called Journal of Political Economy Micro. So I'm an editor of 2 journals now, and I try to be honest, fair, and kind in my letters. I want my notes and reports to be, if they saw me write that on my computer, that I wouldn't be embarrassed or ashamed. And I have no problem signing my name to this. And I think if we had a little bit more civility and a little bit more humanity in terms of, think about writing this for one of your children's essays or their reports. And would you talk in such a way to them? And if not, then you shouldn't be writing it.
Yeah.
And you should be proud of what you put on paper, whether it's anonymous or not. So that's my view on the entire approach of anonymous reporting.
There's a whole skill, it seems to me, to disagreeing with someone without being sort of trying to elevate your status as a result of disagreeing.
That's a great point. I think a little bit of theory of mind really goes a long way in these cases. And what I mean by theory of mind is the ability to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and think about all of the work that they've put in and how important that piece of research is to that person.
Right.
And I think the minute you practice or have a little bit of theory of mind, then that can go a long ways and being a kind person too.
Well, that's an awesome place for us to end, John. Thank you for that. Pick up John's book, The Voltage Effect. Believe me, you will get so much value out of it, and you will be surprised by we covered like this much of what's in this book, and just all the examples and all the theories and all the just the real stuff. It's not like it isn't this. It's I don't know. To me, it felt like I was just hanging out with a friend. And I was just being schooled on all these different things that I may have thought a little bit about at some point, but now I think a lot more about them. So, John, thank you so much for writing the book. You can Follow John on Twitter at econ4everyone. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with, John?
No, I just want to say thanks so much for your kind words. They mean a lot. And thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it, Mike.
My pleasure.
This broadcast is brought to you by Wincheck Studios. We are an all-in-one educational platform for podcasters that revolutionizes how hosts leverage content to increase engagement with listeners, downloads, and income. We come together to focus on community, collaboration, and collective impact. For more information on how you can interact directly with our hosts, access exclusive live content with offers you can't get anywhere else from our official partners, join our purpose-driven community by visiting www.winject.com. If you're ready to build a career doing what you love, then we're ready to see you there.